What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. There are moments when stone and metal start talking louder than any speeches. No slogans, no flags waving, no dramatic music in the background, just numbers. Just numbers, names, rows, columns, and a silence that feels heavier than any official statement ever could. Somewhere near Khabarovsk, in a township most people outside the region will never visit, a new memorial has appeared. Officially it is meant to honor fallen heroes, and officially it exposes something the system desperately tries to hide. The scale. The scale of loss, scale of indifference, scale of how disposable human lives have become inside a machine that no longer even pretends to protect them. On paper it was just a ceremony, an eternal flame, a wall with names, children lighting a torch in memory of a parent who never came back. But once you start counting, once you start connecting the dots, once you remember what unit was stationed there and where it was sent, the picture changes fast. This is not just about grief. This is about how loss is being normalized and quietly justified. So today, let's talk about that particular memorial, what it represents, and why it may end up saying more about the system that built it, rather than the people whose names are carved into it. Knyaze-Volkonskoye, the name of this settlement, does not usually make headlines. It's just a barracks town near Khabarovsk, the kind of place defined almost entirely by the military presence embedded into it. Shops, housing, daily routines, all orbit around one single thing, the military base. And that base belongs to a unit whose name has become infamous far beyond the region. The newly unveiled memorial stands there now, quietly displaying what official briefings prefer to blur. The wall itself is pretty simple. Rows of names arranged into columns. But once you start counting, the simplicity becomes very unsettling. 10 columns for recent years alone. 33 names here, 32 there, 22 in another, 11 in the last, and so many more around the column. Add them up, and you're already nearing 300 people. And that is even without touching earlier periods, where more names are carved into other monuments. Together, the total climbs well past 400 individuals. No missing status, not injured, just confirmed losses. Confirmed by the Russian state. Meaning that the real number is probably much higher. This is where symbolism kicks in, whether the architects intended it or not. This town hosts a brigade that was sent into some of the most controversial operations of the early invasion. A unit accused of actions that later shocked even those who had grown numb to bad news. Many of these names from earlier years likely belong to the original roster. People who went in first, people who did not come back. What makes this harder to ignore is the contrast. The local memorial dedicated to an older war, one that shaped collective memory for generations, still lacks the very same honors. No eternal flame there, no upgraded ensemble, but this new wall tied to a modern campaign still unfolding gets a level of recognition that borders of reverence. That contrast alone tells you something about priorities. And as people stand in front of that wall, the question shifts. It's no longer how many, it becomes why this way? Why memorialize at this scale with such speed while the conflict itself is still grinding on with no end in sight? To answer that, we need to look at the unit's history and how accountability inside the system actually works, which brings our discussion to the next chapter. If you follow the trail behind that memorial, you do not find heroism. You find courtrooms, testimonies, and people quietly fleeing the country. Over the past few years, several members of this same brigade have spoken out. Some from exile, some from inside Russia at great personal risk. And their stories paint a picture that clashes violently with the Polish narrative carved into stone. One young serviceman, for example, testified about widespread abuses inside the unit, about unlawful orders, about actions against civilians, about how refusal was not an option and silence was the only survival strategy. Another one, who fled abroad entirely, later confirming similar accounts. At one point, sources indicated that hundreds inside the brigade were actively seeking a way out, not because they were cowards, but because they saw where the conveyor belt led. And yet, just look at the outcomes. Lower-ranking individuals faced consequences not for actions in the field, but for speaking, just speaking publicly. Charges were reframed, language mattered more than conduct. Meanwhile, senior figures were rewarded. Decorations were handed out, titles elevated, the unit itself received honorary status shortly after its most notorious deployment. The message could not be just clearer. Loyalty upward matters more than responsibility downward. This creates a surreal dissonance. On one hand, you have a memorial listing hundreds of names, silently admitting that losses are enormous. On the other, you have a system that refuses to answer how those losses occurred, or whether they were even avoidable. Instead, remembrance replaces reflection. Stone replaces investigation. And when remembrance becomes automatic, it stops being about memory. It becomes a tool. A way to normalize what should shock. A way to fold tragedy into routine. Which raises another uncomfortable question. What kind of people are being shaped inside this system before their names even reach the wall like that? To explore that, we need to step back and talk about how ordinary individuals behave when placed into extraordinary conditions. So let's explore that in more details in our next chapter. Most people are not born inclined towards cruelty. In everyday life they work, raise families, help neighbors, complain about prices, plan weekends, but just remove them from this environment that enforces rules and accountability. And, well, things change fast. History has proven this repeatedly. When norms collapse and authority demands obedience without limits, behavior follows the structure, not personal morality. This is not speculation. It's been studied, documented, and debated for decades. People comply, they adapt, they justify actions that they would have once found unthinkable. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because the system rewards compliance and punishes resistance. In such conditions, the line between survival and wrongdoing blurs very quickly. And then war accelerates this process even brutally. Especially war framed not as a defense, but as a necessity, inevitability, or destiny. When individuals are told that they are disposable, they begin to act as if others are disposable too. The same conveyor belt that consumes lives also reshapes those who survive it. It produces trauma, guilt, and in some cases, acts that will haunt communities long after the fighting stops. That is why memorials like the one in Knyaze-Volkonskoye are so disturbing. They freeze the outcome without acknowledging the process. They honor the end result while erasing the machinery that produced it. Each name represents not just a life lost, but a chain of decisions that never had to be made. And as these memorials multiply across the entire country by thousands, something else becomes visible. The sheer pace. New walls, new obelisks, new ceremonies. They appear so frequently and so many of them that they begin to normalize the idea that this level of loss is acceptable, even expected. Which brings us to the broader pattern behind all this and why it matters far beyond one small town. So let's move into that discussion in our final chapter. There is an irony the system cannot escape. Its obsession with monuments is becoming evidence against itself. Every newly unveiled memorial quietly confirms what official reports avoid admitting. People are being expanded at industrial speed. Entire units are cycled through leadership structures that rarely face consequences for disastrous decisions. Losses are absorbed, replaced, or absorbed and then absorbed again. Even voices once loyal to the narrative have started acknowledging this reality finally. Well, but only indirectly so far, well, at least something. When insiders admit that entire formations are replenished multiple times within a year, the scale becomes undeniable. When comparisons are made between material losses and human losses, and the latter is treated as less significant, something fundamentally has broken. What makes this especially grim is the absence of open discussion. Asking reasonable questions about responsibility remains dangerous. Suggesting that some names on memorial walls might be tied to wrongdoing is treated as the offense itself. I mean, yes. So silence becomes mandatory, reflection becomes punishable, and yet reality does not need permission. Cemeteries expand whether or not discussions are allowed. Families grieve regardless of official language. The land remembers even when textbooks will not. These memorials may change in the future. They may be redesigned, hidden or quietly ignored, but the burial grounds will remain. They are much harder to reframe. This is the long shadow of a system that chose momentum over humanity, A system that pulled people out of civilian life, reshaped them under pressure, and then discarded them. And the tragedy is not just that lives ended, it's that they were redirected into paths they never needed to walk in the first place. The memorial in Knyaze-Volkonskoye is not just about remembrance. It's a snapshot of a system caught in its own contradictions. It honors loss while refusing accountability. It elevates symbols while suppressing discussion. It counts names while avoiding causes. Each name on that wall belonged to someone who should have been somewhere else. At home, at work, with family, living just an ordinary, boring life that never required becoming part of a machine designed to consume people. Instead, they became entries in a ledger that keeps growing. Understanding this does not bring them back, but ignoring it guarantees repetition. These conversations matter precisely because they are discouraged. And as long as new memorials keep appearing, the questions they raise will only get louder. And guys, if you found today's discussion important, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. There is a lot more to unpack about how systems like this operate, how they sustain themselves, and what happens after the monuments stop feeling new. We will keep talking about these things and even more things that Kremlin cannot hide in the future videos. Thanks so much for watching. If you wish to support our work, the links down below. For example, an additional chapter at the end of each episode on my Patreon. The link is down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow. Well, guess what? This happens in Russia too. Surprise, surprise. And right here, for example, is once again what you would think that this is how local people repair the road, but well, no. It is the local authorities ordered this repairing company. I don't know how they're called, people who repair works, like workers, roadside workers. I don't know. Please let me know down in the comments how they're called, but you get the idea. And well, they just use the methods that are completely unsustainable, bad, shocking, and absolutely not gonna work.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are resolve they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe